Welcome everyone, Costin here with some early game tips for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires to have a much easier time with your campaign, getting the hang of things, being able to get an advantage over the AI, because you are going to be at a disadvantage in many ways. You're going to be at the disadvantage in terms of control, you're going to be at the disadvantage in terms of recruitment slots. The AI gets a recruitment slot advantage over you, especially on higher difficulties, upkeep benefits, growth benefits, and so on. The AI has a lot of advantages given to them just to make up for the issues the AI has in general compared to the player. Though, of course, you need to know what you're doing in order to make these to make the game work. Otherwise, you're just going to be steamrolled by the early tide of death that is going to come your way. And Total War Warhammer 1, 2, and 3 especially have been games where the early game matters significantly more than the late game. The late game has always been easier in these games compared to the early game, because you need to do a lot of things right in the early game. You learn those, and then you just end up being the steamroller yourself. Now, some factions have it much easier than others. The faction I'm showing here, the Empire, is not the easiest start. In fact, it's one of the harder starts in the game, although the Empire is certainly a fairly solid faction, minus the Imperial system, which does need some work. Now, the first thing I want to talk about here in this video, and I've done a whole comprehensive guide, if you will, I'll link that at the end of this video, about playing the game in general. It's long, it doesn't have timestamps. I know people care about that. This is more simple, more focused on certain things that you should pay attention of, and it does assume that you do know some of the basics of the game. But the first thing to talk about when it comes to the game is observation. Looking at your position on the campaign map, knowing what you're going to do. Now, if you don't necessarily know the map very well, if you want to get the hang of things easier, I would recommend a mod. I'll link it in the description if I can. It's simply called Toggle Fog of War, and it will toggle the Fog of War on the map and allow you to see things much clearly. I'm not using this to cheat, I'm just using this to showcase things in terms of positions and just get the better layout of the map myself. So over here, I start in the province of Reichland. I start a war with two factions. First off, it is a rebellion, the Imperial Secessionists, but if I look at the diplomacy screen, there's also a war herd, the Beastmen faction, which starts way over here under Khazrak, but you can be certain that they are going to be a threat to you, because the another faction they start a war with, which is Middenland, is not going to pose much of a threat. None of their electoral counts are really going to be able to stop the major threats that they are dealing with, which is a problem you're going to have to deal with if you're playing the Empire. But observation. So already there are two threats. You can clearly see them even without the Toggle Fog of War. But there is more to it than just that. To the west, we have Marienburg. They don't particularly like you. They likely will declare war on you, and you're going to have to deal with them. But there is a problem with that. If you go to Marienburg, you ideally want to take their entire province to wipe them out. But if you take their entire province, then that puts you at risk from the Norskans. You have Wulfric here as a legendary lord, and you have Bellicor. Neither of them likes you, and both of them are likely, if you come in contact with them, both of them are likely to declare war against you. So Marienburg is a potential problem, but not necessarily one you want to wipe them up. If you have to fight them, get the peace element, let them hold their province, let them deal with those threats themselves, or hold on for as long as they can, because you've got other priorities. To the southwest, you do have a Greenskin faction, a fairly powerful one, though the AI certainly doesn't utilize their power to the potential, but under Grom the Punch. And Grom starts here in Betonia, and he's quite likely going to declare war against you. Now, in order for him to come for you, he has to go through this pass, or for the underway, to reach you. But generally, what Grom will want to do is go for Helmgard, which isn't under your control. So that's a situation you need to rectify. But these are just early game issues. Helmgard, the Imperial Secessionists, Grom, Marienburg, Khazrak, just very early game issues, like turn 10 issues, so to speak. Longer term, we have Festus here, the Leech Lord, who's going to wipe out one of the elector counts and affect your Imperial authority. And Vlad over here in Castle Drakenhof later on. And there's Draika, Azak, plenty of problems to deal with when you're playing the Empire. Observation, knowing what you're going to dealing with in any particular campaign, regardless of the legendary lord you're picking, knowing how to plan around that. Key elements around this. The AI is generally very aggressive towards the player in particular. So if a certain faction is already against you, they're far more likely to declare war against you. And because the AI is biased against the player regardless, AI factions in general are far more likely to declare war against the player regardless, on every difficulty pretty much. So that is something you're going to have to be aware of, just the power of observation. You do have an idea of where all of the elector counts start, what they start with. If I look at the map here, just scrolling around a bit, you have a good idea of the Empire, and if I look at the electoral system. But this is just an example. Every faction, every legendary lord has their own issues to deal with and has to plan their campaign around dealing with those issues and moving ahead. So that's the first issue to deal with. The first tip I would give. The power of observation, observing your surroundings, observing what you're going to deal with. And not just at the start, but throughout the campaign, so you don't have nasty surprises. You should always be aware of where your diplomatic standing with various factions surrounding you is at any given point, so you can expect certain factions to behave in a certain way towards you. Though generally factions may declare war on you even out of the blue. Now, with that said, when you start a campaign, another thing you want to do is looking at the diplomacy and seeing what you can get done very, very quickly. So in this case, I can get a bunch of non-aggression pacts with a bunch of factions. Now, you want to do this for two reasons. One, it will give you some gold. So in this case, I get agreements with various factions, though you don't necessarily want to get all of them. Trade agreements on aggression packs, all that. Trade will increase your income. If trade is something your faction can do, not every faction can do it. Not every faction will have non-aggression options. But that's just giving me some gold to work with. And crucially, non-aggression pacts are basically a promise to not attack each other. If you try and break it, like let's say you signed one and you want to break it, it will take 10 turns for you to be able to do that without a major diplomatic downside, because it affects your reliability if you break an agreement. And after you end the non-aggression pact, like at 10 turns after you can end the non-aggression pact, let's say you wait 10 turns, you end it, then you have to wait 10 more turns to be able to declare war against another faction, barring certain circumstances. Now, the AI is not bound by these rules, these pesky little rules. You, however, are. Now, you can still do it, don't get me wrong, but it will affect your reliability rating, which will make it more difficult to get agreements with every other faction in the game. So, getting these kind of diplomatic agreements, non-aggression pacts, trade, military access, important. But here's something you should be aware of. If you make any agreement, diplomatic agreement with a faction, the enemies of that faction are going to dislike you for it. So by making a non-aggression pact with Midland, Khazrak dislikes me more. In fact, I can probably see it if I go to the diplomacy screen, and you can see that for the treaties I've signed with Midland, my relationship with Khazrak has been affected by -12 for just non-aggression pact. And you can be certain that's going to apply to all of their enemies. Generally, it's safe to get non-aggression pacts, trade agreements, and military access. The things you want to avoid for the most part are defensive alliances, because that means when a faction gets attacked, you're going to be dragged into it, or you break your alliance with all the reliability impact that breaking a treaty has, or military alliances, unless you're sure. Don't get dragged in wars you don't intend to fight. That would be a strong advice, but even in some cases, with certain factions, you may not even want to get non-aggression pacts or military access. I'll give you a great example of this, toggling the fog of war. Belegar Ironhammer starts over here in this province. He shares a border with Tylea. He can get non-aggression pact, military access, trade with Tylea, though Tylea is generally going to be wiped by Sartosa fairly quickly, because that's the early game plan of Sartosa. Now, Belegar doesn't want to deal with Sartosa, but here's the thing, Sartosa doesn't particularly like him, and by making any pact, any trade deal, any agreement with with Tylea, he just pisses off Certosa. Certosa is quite likely, after they finish dealing with Tylea, to want to declare war against Belegar. Though if you make no agreement with Tylea, that is far, far less likely, because you haven't pissed them off unnecessarily. So just be aware. Power of observation, diplomacy, it all ties together. So with those early diplomatic options undertaken, and you want to do them as the first thing, because you don't want to fight a battle, lose some men, and then factions behave differently towards you, because factions will behave differently dependent on your strength ranking. Now this won't be updated until you click the intern ranking intern button, but if you lose troops, if you suffer casualties in your army, AI factions will view you as weaker and actually be less willing to engage in diplomacy with you. So it's pretty important to get that right and get those kind of agreements early on. And by the way, there's more things I can do, like this faction right here. I can just pay them a bit of money and get a non-aggression pact as well with them. Worth taking. Like, even if it's just like a small amount of money or even more than that, sometimes it's worth making those steps. Now, battle-wise, we have to talk about manual battles, auto-resolve. So this is on the highest difficulty. If I fight this battle manually, I'll lose few men, get the decisive victory. Okay, that doesn't seem too bad, right? And post-battle options, I lost 159 men, killed 571. Gain some money and gain some captives. Now here's the thing, if I fight this battle manually, I can capture more enemies and get more loot and better replenishment or more income or experience. Or if you're playing a faction with a special resource, you can gain more of that special resource in the post-battle loot, dependent on how many enemies you've killed, how many enemies you've captured. The auto-resolve is always going to inflict more casualties on you than the vast majority of battles you can play yourself, and it's going to be less reward than by and large than if you played those battles yourself. It isn't the case in every situation. Sometimes the auto-resolve is better for you, but let's look at this. I click replenishment, right? Replenish those numbers, go over here to attack Grunberg, and it's a valiant defeat. I will lose if I auto-resolve. Now, could I still win this even though I auto-resolved the first battle? Sure. I could still win this fighting it manually, because this is a melee army. They only have one ranged unit. I've got cavalry, I've got a legendary lord, I've got great swords. This is a battle I should win, even an auto-resolve. I'm not sure how the auto-resolve works. I think it assigns points to your army based on heroes, lords, units, all that. And it does give settlements a benefit, like the AI has a benefit, also because of the difficulty, so they do gain a benefit in auto-resolve. But if I click this, I lose my entire army. I've suffered significant losses. My strength ranking is going to be affected in a major way, and you can already see diplomatic changes, like factions are already going to be far less willing to deal with me. And especially after this turn, if I were to end the turn here, they would be even less willing to do so. So you need to play those early game battles. So when it comes to fighting the battles, here's what I would say for the vast majority of the battles. The tactics aren't too complicated, don't complicate your life. Generally make a line of melee units in the front, artillery and range units behind. Now, I can't do that with range units behind because I have handgunners. Now, handgunners need a straight line or need elevation advantage to shoot the enemy, so I need to put them on the side so that they can shoot the enemy. On top of that, you can use your legendary lord, unless he's a caster, unless he's squishy, you can use your legendary lord to soak a lot of damage. They'll be much better at this than the vast majority of the units in your arsenal. Depends on the lord, depends on the units. Now with this kind of line deployed, and because of I have artillery, the enemy is going to attack me. Now, what the AI does depends on a number of factors. If you have artillery and you're bombarding them, even if they're on the defensive, the attacker in a battle needs to be the one that wins the battle. If the timer expires, you're the one who's losing the battle, no matter how well you've done. But the AI in general will attack the player if you either use spells on them or you're shooting at them from range. Though it does, of course, depend on the kind of situation you've created. Now, in this case, because I am bombarding the AI, I am going to bait the AI to attack me. Now, I'm also going to do something else in that I'm going to move Karl Franz to the front there. By the way, mortars can miss as an artillery.
To battle! Take the ground!
And I'm going to pull back those handgunners so that they don't suffer a lot of casualties.
Sigma calls! Sigma calls! Ready? For the Emperor!
Now he's going for my handgunners over there. The enemy lord is going for my handgunners. But I baited them successfully. He decided to go after my cavalry at the start over there. Now he's going after my mortars, it feels like. And because I moved Karl Franz to the front, the AI, a significant portion of the enemy army was out of position. They got hit by a direct mortar shot. They suffered tremendous casualties because of that. And I've been able to flank them very successfully. Just some basic battle tactics to be aware of. You can either kill the enemy or you can inflict morale losses on individual units or entire army losses. There is a balance of power. It can't be shown here because it is on the highest difficulty, but in general there is a meter that fills up in battles. And what that meter it represents is the difference between the strength, basically, of each army. If it's if one faction is too favored versus the other, then that will create major morale benefit downsides for the faction that is losing. And that will eventually cause the entire army to rout. So inflict enough casualties on the enemy army, it will break purely because of that, while minimizing your own casualties. If things stay even throughout the battle, if it's not one-sided, then it won't trigger. But if, like you in this case, you decimate the army here, I decimated the army here with very few casualties very quickly. That mortar shot on those crossbowmen was really nice. The cavalry charge on the flank was really nice. I was able to win this battle with very few casualties compared to what I received, and I was able to rout them very quickly on the highest difficulty in the game. Okay, so you can see compared to the over 100 men that I would lose in auto-resolve here, I only lost 27. And you know what? I can replenish all of them very quickly here. Very hard, legendary, just to be clear.
In the name of Magnus.
And now I've leveled. But this doesn't matter too much right now. I don't need to spend any point. I could just go to the next battle. But when it comes to leveling, I'm not going to go into too much detail. But the first skill you'll generally want is one that gives you campaign movement range. Then the red line skill. So blue line, red line. Some legendary lords are an exception, but by and large, most lords will have campaign movement range as their first blue line skill. Some exceptions deviate from this. Most will have it. And then red line skill, which will give your units experience per turn 75 and give you a leadership bonus. Now with this, with my victorious army, I go to Grunberg. Compared to the valiant defeat earlier, this would be a Pyrrhic victory. I'd still lose one unit, but in a substantially better situation. Still don't want to auto-resolve it, because I can go with this, win with relative ease. But how is that? What's the logic? How would I be able to win with relative ease? Just to explain that very quickly. Well, I have 3 range units. 2 handgunners can do a lot of range damage and a mortar unit. And you can bait the enemy army to surround, like Karl Franz. He's a pretty decent melee combatant and can take quite a bit of punishment. Get them, surround them, hit them with the mortars, hit them with the ranged units, do some cavalry charges, win very easily. Now, when dealing with minor settlement battles or siege battles, the thing to understand is that the attacker has significant advantages over the defender. But how is that? I mean, the defender should have enormous advantages with towers, barricades, walls potentially, towers on the walls. How is it that the attacker ends up being the one with a lot of advantages? Well, it comes down to initiative. If you are the attacker, you can decide where you want to attack. Now, the AI generally will deploy its defenses, its towers and barricades, dependent on where you've been. Now, they do this instantly. Yes, they fucking cheat. Because they know where you've deployed your forces before the battle. So, yeah, the AI is a bloody cheater. Nothing new. But the attacker will have the advantages because you have the initiative. You can decide where you're going to attack, how you're going to attack. The defender can only react to what the attacker is doing, and that gives the attacker all of the benefits in a battle like this. On top of that, the problem that the defender may face is that they can't really fully utilize the advantages they have. Towers have line of sight issues, as an example, a lot of the times, and that obviously creates its own set of issues. Now here I'm going to start shooting at that barricade to clear the path. Barricades are generally a nuisance when it comes to these particular kind of battles. Also, the AI is pretty good at dodging mortars, you gotta notice. Though not in every case. Now, the AI usually won't leave the confines of the settlement bounds, if you will. Though they've been able to inflict quite a few losses on me over here on my handgunners, but that's just fine. I didn't necessarily deploy them in the best possible way there. I'm just gonna pull them back before things get a bit nasty. And I'm still going to shoot. The mortar got a good, really good shot. Handgunners are great units. Okay. What is going on here? And there's, of course, pathfinding issues, as you might imagine. But I am going to take these guys, and I'm also going to do another mortar strike on that big blob of infantry. Yeah, defenders do end up having a lot of issues, as you can see. A good charge over there. And many of the enemy units will start breaking. Be careful when you're shooting your artillery or your spells, though. You may end up hitting your own guys. And victory, because the balance powers shifted so much in my favor that I was able to win. Some casualties on the handgunners, though it's not going to be too big of a deal for the campaign. And certainly fewer losses than if I had auto-resolved this, by the way. So with that settlement taken, what choices do I have? I can occupy, loot and occupy, or sack it, or raise it. Depending on the faction, you may have different options, but these are the most common ones. Well, looting and occupying will give you less income and will have a significant public order penalty, but it also replenish your units, 8% in my case. Sacking will give you the most amount of money, a less reduced public order penalty, although this act of sacking a settlement in itself will reduce its level by 1. But it doesn't matter since this is a level 1 settlement anyway, so I'm going to sack it for the money, and I'm then going to occupy it. Because I've sacked the settlement, the structures are damaged, but it is not necessarily the biggest concern. So with these first battles dealt with, it's time to raise, start upgrading the main settlement building of Altdorf, the main settlement building you have. This is something you want to do with pretty much every faction you can do it. Level up Karl Franz again, and then we can start talking recruitment. My goal is to take Helmgart, wipe these guys out very quickly, turn 5, turn 6.
Who calls?
But this is where we get into a key point. The AI gets more recruitment than you. Now these guys do start with an army over here in Helmgart. They'll recruit quite a few units, and they'll be able to recruit faster than me. But how do I get the army necessary to take something like Helmgart, which is a heavily fortified settlement? Well, I do start local recruitment. Keep in mind, I want to do this quickly. So I want to take this element extremely quickly, but it's going to take 2 turns to get to it. Now I could do global recruitment on Karl Franz's army, but that would prevent him from moving for 2 turns. Global recruitment is slower for most part. Some factions do get benefits when it comes to reducing global recruitment, but not Karl Franz, not instantly anyway. So I'm just going to do local recruitment. Local recruitment is province-wide, so I can recruit anywhere in the province and settlements that I own locally. Global recruitment is global. It works differently for certain factions, but I want to get 2 archer units there. If you have good range units from the start, generally focus on getting a lot of them early on, because range power is still very, very good in the game. Later on, you can focus on things like artillery, things like melee units, all that, but for the most part, basic ranged units are the way to go for any faction. But since I do want larger numbers to take these settlements, Eilhart, Helmgart, I will need more troops, especially to make up for the fact that on Legendary I'm at a severe disadvantage when it comes to recruitment. So what I'm going to do is recruit another Lord over here early on. And the one I'm going to choose depends on the benefits you do get. So over here, I think I'm going to get the General of the Empire for the leadership benefit. And I'm going to globally recruit 2 units of swordsmen, or maybe 1 unit of swordsmen, 2 units of archers. Also going to level him up, because he does get a level benefit, because Karl Franz gives them a level of benefit. Then there's research. Do research at the end of a turn and interrupt it. Like when a turn starts, just pause it. You can, and pick off where you left off. Just pause it. There is an item you can get, or an ancillary that you can get that will increase the research rate. So okay, I've started recruitment, getting some units in the first turn. So right now, I'm recruiting 5 units. I already have 9. And of course, 2 lords, 9 units. I'm recruiting 5 extra on turn 1. They'll be ready by turn 3, all of them. And it will be 2 extra units on top of that. So it's 7 units within 2 turns that I'll be able to recruit. And I'll be able to move Karl Franz's army closer to the enemy settlement while doing local recruitment, because you can move, then start local recruitment. Now why do this? Why global recruit? Why focus so much? Because the key to winning a campaign is early game aggression. You want to take as much of the land as possible, you want to eliminate as many enemies as possible, and you want to make as much money as possible. This is not a game that favors turtling. This is not a game where being passive will pay off. You want to eliminate your enemies as quickly as possible. In this case, eliminating me a bulwark against Grom, who's to the southwest, allows me to move my armies to the north to deal with Castrak, to deal with Festus. That is why I am doing it. Every campaign has its own issues, but every single campaign in the game will reward you being aggressive. If you're passive, if you're defensive, you will lose. So I've moved Karl Franz here, and I'm gonna get 2 more units recruited. He's gonna finish it, and he's gonna be able to move his units to that settlement. Now, because the first turn is over, let's look at some more diplomatic options. Auckland has lost its main army, and they're very weak. So now they're quite willing to engage, to give me a lot of money for a non-aggression pact. Karak Norn as well. And these are just non-aggression pacts. If I look at the other options, trade, military access, Midland is willing to give me military access. Pretty important since I'll be traipsing around through their territory. And Ice Court also military access. Not an enormous amount of coin. And sometimes you may want to wait with some of these diplomatic options to get more coin. Like, you don't necessarily want to get a non-aggression pact or military access on turn 1. Though keep in mind, the situation is dynamic. Things are not always certain in a campaign you are playing, so things can change. Now, the AI army has moved over there to Wileheart. They are not defending the settlement. Still very hard legendary. Let's end the second turn. Okay, I believe they've either moved again or Marienburg, who doesn't particularly like them either, done me a major favor. I'm not quite entirely certain. Yeah, they've moved to Helmgard to defend it. Alright, I was just toggling Fog of War, I was uncertain. Obviously that's cheating, you don't want to use that, but I was just kind of wondering where they had gone. They could have gone an ambush stance to try and ambush me. Though there isn't a lot of room they would have had here, and they wouldn't have... the AI will try and avoid fights it can't. It fights it doesn't believe it can win. So, if I had to resolve this, this would be a decisive victory. But again, I would take significantly more casualties. Now over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the army to Karl Franz and transfer these units. Now, when moving a forced march, your units would be tired. However, if you transfer them to another army, they won't be, I believe so. And so although he's going to be tired if he joins this battle, his units that he just gave Karl Franz, and that's 16 units, will not be. Now over here, I could not resolve it. It would be decisive, casualties low. But 300 casualties when I could afford to do this battle while barely losing any men, not exactly the greatest situation in the world, to be quite honest. Now here I'm just going to loot and occupy it for the casualty replenishment. But yeah, most of the time you would have wanted to fight that battle yourself, though obviously the casualty replenishment made up for it. Now over here, there's another trick. You can... Now, he's in forced march, right? But I don't need to keep him. That's the thing. I can either disband him and get another lord, which is what I'm going to do, or I could replace him at the head of the army and switch from forced march, I believe. Though in this case, I'm just going to choose to get another hero. And actually, I am going to move Karl Franz out of the settlement. Even when you have no movement points, you can always move out of settlement and do some global recruitment. And start that global recruitment again. Now, I think Karl Franz could certainly benefit from...
My orders are to move. Yes, my lord.
From some infantry. Now here I'm gonna move some of these units over here so that they can get better replenishment because they're in the settlement. Just this turn.
The Empire.
And it will be better replenishment. Do the global recruitment and get some swordsmen as well. Now Karl Franz is leveled again. One of the things to understand is if you're focusing on after this, focus on your basic units. Or you can go blue line, get some control and all that. Depends on the faction again. But for Karl Franz, he's going to want to improve his ranged unit capability. For him, we're just gonna get these two right here. I've spent quite a bit of money on this. I'll spend even more.
The nation.
Looking at diplomatic options, none really available. And end the turn
Yes. To unite
again.
the provinces.
And move Karl Franz a bit, apparently. The reason I've done global recruitment, the AI's got quite a few units. Even if they've just been traipsing around wasting their turns, they still have quite a few units over there. They are in forced march, but I will want extra units. And it's not just for dealing with them, it is for dealing with threats in general. You do want to get at least a full stack of units as quickly as possible to deal with all the threats that are standing in your way. Now over here I do have some choices. A dilemma has popped up. This is an Imperial specific thing. Affects fealty. Fealty indicates how a faction, like the loyalty, basically a faction feels to you. It gets to 0, they'll declare war on you. It gets to 10, they'll offer to confederate with you. Now in this case, I do have pretty close fealty. I think I'm going to support Sterling because Ostermark is quite likely going to be wiped out. Just pays off to get better relations with Sterling, surprisingly. Right, so these units have gotten a lot of replenishment, and I am just going to move all of them back. He's still going to do global recruitment, but Karl Franz at turn 4 already has 18 units. He's going to get some more. Let's do more local recruitment for swordsmen and continue over here. Now, could I assault this and win? Maybe. It would be a difficult battle, but I can just encircle it. And AI will likely feel, in this specific case, depends on the situation, but you gotta know how to judge these things. The AI may very well decide that attacking me in this situation, like waiting an extra turn, wouldn't be so bad. Just waiting an extra turn for these units to be built. Now, here I'm gonna get the rally field, get that to 2, get some industry, and also get a clay pit. Usually, with pretty much every faction, you want to focus most of your building slots, early game building slots, you want to focus them on the economy, maybe public order, though I don't necessarily need that right now. By either economy or public order or both. Just gonna repair these buildings. I do have some money to spare, even if I'm probably gonna be at the deficit compared to what I gained from looting and occupying that settlement, but I did it for casualty replenishment's sake. Though I did casualty replenishment because I lost a lot of units in the auto resolve that I shouldn't have really if I had fought the battle manually. Looking at some diplomatic choices, gonna get the non-aggression with them.
By Sigma's will, coming
here, you might think that, oh, I could get a trade agreement. They're not long for this world, I'm gonna tell you that, so don't really bother with it. And gonna pay them. Actually, I will not pay them because they're asking quite a bit of money, and I don't want to do that. Always weigh the benefits of doing something like that. Right, so end the turn again. Alright, the turn has ended, and they did not sally out. They could have, they decided not to. Just gonna upgrade my buildings, move my army. Gonna transfer some of those units to Karl Franz. Although, since I'm going in the shadow of an Imperial fort, the fort will intercept them. So either way, auto-resolve. It might have been better had I done it. Now what's interesting about this intercept thing, just a little tidbit, is this counts as fighting a battle in open field, even though the battle would be fought in the settlement. So I get the same benefits as I would get for an open field battle. But also, if I look here, I can also get sacking benefits. Now he's going to give some of these units to Karl Franz.
Move!
Specifically the 2 swordsman units. And he's gonna move right here
It is time.
on the edge. Now, speaking about recruiting units, recruitment is province-wise, normal recruit. So I could get a unit of archers here with Karl Franz. And in fact, I believe I will do just that. Just merge these two, get a unit of archer. I left, I shouldn't have transferred as many units as I did. That's on me. But I'm recruiting these units over here. And next turn, we will be able to finish securing the initial province, get Karl Franz more skill points. He's also leveled up, buffed the melee units. Economic progress development is happening. Sterling wants some agreements. I'll give them that because, and I'll get the military access. That's a good thing. Commandment available because it is a different province. I'll get the growth. Here, the Imperial forts are special structures. They don't work normally. They don't have public order to deal with. They just have very strong garrison. And here I'm within striking distance of Eilhart. It's turn 6. If they had sallied out of Helmgart, I could have taken Eilhart on turn 5. But that's just an example. Things can obviously vary like this. Or I could have assaulted Helmgart myself and taken it on turn 5. No, turn 4, sorry. Some choices, consequences. Basically, I lost the turn because I didn't want to fight the manual siege battle. Consequences of decisions being made.
Just war.
Now I lose a swordsman unit, but I don't really care right there. And I'm just going occupied. And so within the first 6 turns, the Imperial Secessionists are finished. The Reichland province is under my control, and I've got the sturdy fortress to protect the south from Grom whenever he does decide to move against me. My immediate campaign goals after this are going to be dealing with Kazrak, who is probably in ambush stance around here, and then going after Festus, who's already laying siege to Hochland. It's quite likely he's going to wipe out Hochland. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. I've seen him waste 10 turns dealing with Hochland. I've seen him wipe them out in 4 turns. Depends on the RNG. It is not something you can control. But here's the key points. Observe what you're going to be dealing with. Fight battles manually because you will suffer fewer casualties. Use the diplomacy, early game diplomacy, non-aggression pacts, military access, and so on. And be aggressive. 5-6 turns is really good to get the Imperial Secessionist, and now I can probably be in Hochland in 3 turns. I'll probably have to fight Kazrak along the way, while also leaving some forces in support over here, but that is quite fine. Quite fine indeed. And I could have suffered fewer casualties had I fought all of these battles on my own. Had I not out-resolved all these battles, or some of these battles like Eilhart, the settlements here, Helmgart itself, I would have suffered fewer casualties. So fighting battles manually, being aggressive, getting a lot of units very, very quickly for global recruitment or whatever options you have dependent on the faction, even if you're going to spend a lot of coins. But be proactive, be aggressive, take the initiative. Even if the enemy is beating down on your door, take the initiative. That's the most important thing I can say here. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications. If you want a more detailed guide that goes more in depth about building, research, all that kind of stuff, check out the video that's going to appear on the screen. Check out the video. It covers the High Elves, which I think is one of the best factions to go for as a new player. These are just some tips, more detail. That video is a lot longer, of course, as I'm going through, some of the early game turns, going into detail why I'm doing what I'm doing, and it will help you out a great deal. Hope you all liked it, and stay tuned for more.